Comrades, I stand before you today not merely to speak, but to expose a truth that the rulers of our world have spent centuries concealing, that dependence, the very condition imposed upon the labouring masses, is not a natural state of human life, but a weapon of control wielded by capital against us. Open your eyes. Look around you. The chains of servitude are not forged of iron alone. They are built into the very structures of society, disguised as necessity, convenience, or opportunity. We live in a world where your labour is no longer yours, where the fruits of your toil are plucked from your hands before they even have a chance to nourish your life. Capital has perfected a system in which dependence is not an accident, it is the design. You are made to depend on wages, on employment, on the market, on credit. And through this dependence, the ruling class asserts control over not just your work, but your very existence. They dictate the hours of your life, the conditions under which you labour, and the means by which you survive. They make your hunger, your health, your education, your very well-being contingent upon their mercy. This is no mere inequality. It is a deliberate, systematic mechanism of domination. When a worker depends entirely on a wage for survival, they are coerced into compliance. When the poorest must choose between shelter and sustenance, they are rendered silent and powerless. Capital does not simply exploit. It engineers consent through the creation of need, and in this way, dependence becomes the instrument of oppression, a tool to divide, isolate, and subjugate the working class. But let us be clear, this dependence is not eternal. It is neither natural nor inevitable. It is a product of a social order constructed for the enrichment of a few at the expense of the many. The capitalist does not hesitate to claim that the worker is free, that the market is just, that poverty is the result of individual failure. These are lies. Freedom under. Capitalism is freedom only for the property-owning class. To labour for wages, to be bound by debt, to live precariously while producing wealth for others. This is not freedom, it is servitude masked as choice. Understand, comrades, that the ruling class depends on your ignorance of your own power. They fear nothing more than the awakening of class consciousness, for when workers see themselves as a collective force, dependence is transformed from a chain into a lever for liberation. The proletariat, united by shared struggle, becomes the architects of its own destiny. Dependence on the wage is replaced by dependence on each other, a solidarity that no capital can conquer. History teaches us that the oppressed do not rise by petitioning the powerful, by appealing to their morality, or by waiting for reform from the very hands that exploit them. Change comes only when the working class recognizes the mechanisms of its subjugation, organizes collectively, and seizes control of production itself. Only by dismantling the structures that convert necessity into obedience can we achieve a society in which labour serves human need, not profit, in which dependence on capital is replaced by cooperation and empowerment. Do not be deceived by the illusions of charity, by the promises of temporary relief, or by the spectacle of consumption. These are tools of distraction meant to mask the deeper reality that your dependence is deliberate, that your exploitation is systematic, and that your liberation is impossible without struggle. The time for subtle resistance has passed. The time for collective action, for organized revolt, and for the creation of a society where wealth and power are shared, not hoarded, is now. Comrades, the chains of dependence are forged in every workplace, every household, every ledger of the capitalist system. But chains can be broken, structures can be overturned, and power can be reclaimed. Rise! Organize! Make your dependence a weapon against the oppressor, not a justification for submission. In the unity of the proletariat lies the force to reshape society, to wrest control from those who profit from your subjugation, and to build a world where humanity, not capital, determines the conditions of life. History will not wait for the meek. The question is not whether change will come, but whether we will be the agents of that change. Let the cry of the oppressed become the roar of a revolution that cannot be silenced, that cannot be bought, and that will not be denied. The day will come when dependence is no longer a tool of control, but a memory of a past struggle, a struggle we must begin today. Capital, in its relentless pursuit of accumulation, has perfected a mechanism by which dependence is converted into domination. The worker, who produces the very wealth that sustains society, finds themselves trapped in a web of necessities imposed not by nature, but by the social order constructed to serve the interests of the ruling class. Wages, ostensibly a reward for labour, are in reality the chains that bind the labourer to the dictates of capital. Survival is no longer a matter of human fulfilment or collective well-being. It is conditional upon the approval of those who own the means of production. The worker depends on employment to secure food, shelter, clothing, and the barest comforts of existence, and it is precisely this dependence that the capitalist exploits. In this system, the individual labourer is coerced into submission, compelled to trade hours of life, energy and creativity for a wage that is always less than the value of what they produce. This dependence is reinforced at every turn. The workers' position in society is defined by their inability to exist independently of the market, which is controlled by capital. The threat of unemployment looms as a constant reminder of the power wielded by the property-owning class. Even the most skilled or diligent labourer cannot escape the structural demands of the economy. To resist is to risk destitution. Capital does not merely extract labour, it ensures that the extraction is absolute by controlling not only the material means of survival, but also the expectations, desires, and aspirations of the working population. Education, healthcare, housing, and social services are often structured in such a way that access depends on compliance with the economic order, further entrenching the workers' subordination. Dependence, however, is not only material, it is psychological and social. Workers are conditioned to see their wages as earned privileges rather than as the rightful returns of their labour. The ideology of meritocracy teaches that success is a matter of individual effort, that poverty is the result of personal failure, and that the structures of exploitation are natural, inevitable, or immutable. In this way, dependence is internalized, transforming a relationship of coercion into one of apparent consent. Workers come to believe that their survival is contingent upon their compliance, and the ruling class achieves control without overt force. This subtlety is what makes capital's dominance so pervasive. The labourer consents to their own subjugation because they cannot imagine survival outside the framework of dependence imposed upon them. The extraction of surplus value is at the heart of this system. The capitalist pays the worker less than the value of what they produce, capturing the remainder as profit. But the workers' dependence ensures that they cannot resist. The threat of hunger or eviction compels them to accept conditions that exploit their labour while enriching others. Capital has thus institutionalized a system in which dependence and control are inseparable. The more a worker relies on wages for existence, the more their autonomy is constrained, the more the behavior is directed by the imperatives of profit rather than the needs of human life. This dependence ensures that the labourer cannot act freely, cannot refuse exploitation, and cannot fully realize their potential as a human being outside the dictates of capital. Moreover, dependence divides and isolates. Workers, aware that their survival relies on continued employment, are pitted against one another in competition for scarce positions, promotions, and wages. Solidarity, which could transform collective dependence into collective power, is undermined by the very conditions that enforce it. Capital manipulates fear and scarcity to maintain control, ensuring that dependence becomes a tool not only of economic extraction, but also of social fragmentation. The labourer is made to feel that their fate is individual, that they alone must navigate the precariousness of life under capitalism, while the ruling class maintains its dominion over society as a whole. Yet dependence is not a permanent condition. It is a social relation, historically specific and therefore susceptible to change through collective awareness and organized action. When workers recognize the mechanisms by which their survival is controlled, when they see that the structures enforcing dependence are not natural but constructed, dependence can become the lever of resistance. The same structures that compel labor can be turned against the exploiters, not by appealing to their benevolence, but by seizing collective control over production, distribution, and social organization. Dependence under capitalism is thus a double-edged reality. It enforces control, yet it also reveals the worker's centrality to the functioning of society. The wealth of the world rests upon the laborer, and the moment they assert solidarity, the illusion of control maintained through dependence begins to fracture. Under the gaze of the capitalist system, freedom is proclaimed as the highest virtue, celebrated as the defining characteristic of modern society. You are free, they say, to choose your work, to pursue your dreams, to buy, to sell, to consume, to live. And yet, behind this glittering facade lies a system designed to exploit, dominate, and control. The freedom of the worker is not freedom at all, but a carefully constructed illusion that conceals the mechanisms of oppression. For the laborer, the choices offered by capitalism are always circumscribed by the imperatives of profit. One may choose among different jobs, but never outside the system that makes labor a commodity. One may choose what to consume, but never escape the economic constraints that determine what is accessible. The very appearance of liberty is a tool of deception, convincing the oppressed that they act autonomously while their actions remain tethered to the interests of capital. Capitalism presents freedom as personal choice, yet in reality, the individual is bound by systemic necessity. Wages are framed as a reward, yet they are a requirement for survival, an invisible leash around the worker's neck. To call this freedom is to obscure the coercive power inherent in economic dependence. Workers labor not out of pure desire or self-fulfillment, but because their survival, the lives of their families, and their place in society depend on compliance with the demands of the market. Every paycheck, every contract, every transaction is a reminder that autonomy under capitalism is conditional. The worker is free only insofar as they do not threaten the accumulation of capital. They are free only within the confines of a system designed to extract value from their labor while restricting their ability to claim the fruits of their own work. This illusion extends beyond the workplace into every dimension of life. Education is sold as opportunity, yet it is often structured to reproduce the inequality of the economic system, training some to manage and others to serve. Health, security, and basic sustenance are framed as privileges earned through effort rather than rights guaranteed to all human beings. The worker internalizes the ideology of capitalism, believing that poverty is a consequence of laziness or incompetence, that wealth is the product of virtue, and that the structures of exploitation are natural, inevitable, or even desirable. In this way, the system masks its own brutality, presenting systemic inequality as a moral or personal issue rather than a social and economic one. The illusion of freedom also serves to isolate the individual and prevent collective resistance. By convincing workers that their struggles are personal, that their successes and failures are their own, capitalism undermines solidarity. Laborers are pitted against one another in competition for scarce resources, wages, and opportunities, while the structural causes of deprivation remain unchallenged. The ideology of individual freedom distracts from the collective reality that workers are the producers of wealth and that their labor, if unified, could command power over production and society itself. Capitalist freedom, therefore, is a cage, a set of choices determined by circumstance, necessity, and the imperatives of profit, rather than by genuine human autonomy. Furthermore, the illusions of freedom are often reinforced through culture, media, and politics. Citizens are encouraged to see themselves as independent actors, to pursue personal advancement, and to measure success by material acquisition. The spectacles of consumption and competition glorify the very system that binds them, creating the sense that participation in the market is the highest expression of liberty. Political freedom, too, is constrained One may vote or voice opinions, but the fundamental structures that distribute wealth and power remain untouched. Choice within these boundaries creates the comforting impression of agency, while the deeper relations of exploitation continue unchallenged. Yet the reality of this systematic exploitation is simple and undeniable. The worker produces wealth that is expropriated by the capitalist who accumulate it as private property. The worker's labor is essential to the functioning of society, and yet the fruits of that labor are systematically denied to them. Capitalism sustains itself not only by material extraction but by ideological manipulation, by convincing the exploited that they are free, even as they are dominated. The illusion of freedom pacifies, distracts and disarms, making resistance appear unnecessary or impossible. Workers labor under the impression of autonomy, while being bound ever more tightly to the mechanisms of exploitation. The recognition of this illusion is the first step toward liberation. When workers perceive that their freedom is conditional, that their choices are constrained by structural necessity, they see the truth of exploitation. Freedom under capitalism is not the absence of coercion, it is coercion disguised as liberty. The moment the working class understands this, the moment they recognize the difference between real human autonomy and the market simulacrum of freedom, the possibility of resistance emerges. To act collectively, to reclaim the wealth that belongs to the producers, to assert genuine control over labor and life itself, this is the path from illusion to reality, from subjugation to emancipation, from passive dependence to active struggle. The awakening of class consciousness is the spark that illuminates the path out of oppression, the recognition by the worker that their suffering is neither natural nor accidental, but the direct result of a social order structured for the benefit of the few. Capitalism depends upon ignorance and division. It thrives by convincing the laboring masses that their struggles are personal, that their deprivation is the product of individual failure, and that the wealth of the ruling class is earned through merit rather than expropriation. The worker, isolated by economic necessity, is made to believe that their fate is singular and immutable, that survival and advancement depend on acquiescence to the demands of capital rather than collective action. It is only when the worker perceives their shared condition with others, the reality that the majority of society produces the wealth while a minority appropriates it, that the illusion of individual responsibility begins to dissolve. Class consciousness is not a mere intellectual recognition. It is the living awareness that emancipation is impossible without solidarity, that no single worker can dismantle the structures of oppression alone, and that only through unity can the chains of exploitation be broken. Worker solidarity is the manifestation of this consciousness in action. It is the collective force that transforms dependence into power, competition into cooperation, and subjugation into organized resistance. Solidarity allows the laborer to perceive that their struggle is part of a broader struggle, that every hour of toil, every grievance endured, is linked to the fate of their fellow workers. Capital fears this unity above all else because it threatens the very foundation of exploitation. When the laboring class acts as a collective, the mechanisms that rely on division and submission falter. The arbitrary authority of the capitalist is revealed as fragile, dependent not on natural law but on the acquiescence of those they exploit. It is in solidarity that the worker finds the means to assert their rightful claim over the fruits of labor, to resist wage suppression, to challenge unsafe conditions, and to transform economic necessity into leverage over production itself. The history of labor struggle demonstrates the potency of collective action. Strikes, unions, and revolts have repeatedly shown that when workers recognize their common interests and act in concert, the balance of power shifts. Individual resistance is easily crushed, isolated, or co-opted, but organized action can confront and reshape the very institutions that enforce exploitation. Worker solidarity transformed scattered grievances into political and economic power, giving voice to the oppressed and visibility to their demands. Class consciousness and solidarity are inseparable. One without the other is impotent. Awareness without organization breeds despair, while organization without consciousness becomes bureaucratic and limited to temporary reforms that leave the fundamental structures of capital intact. Together, consciousness and solidarity are revolutionary. They convert knowledge of oppression into the capacity to overthrow it. Capitalism, for all its sophistication, depends upon the laboring majority's failure to recognize their collective strength. By fostering competition, individualism, and false hierarchies, it prevents workers from uniting. Each worker is made to feel isolated, dispensable, and responsible for their own survival. But this perception is a lie. The wealth of society is created by the labor of the many, and the moment they assert unity, the illusions of scarcity and inevitability collapse. Solidarity enables workers to demand not merely fair compensation but control over production, distribution, and the conditions of life itself. It converts vulnerability into leverage and dependence into strategic advantage. The collective, conscious worker becomes the agent of transformation, no longer constrained by the whims of the capitalist, but capable of shaping society according to human need rather than profit. True liberation requires both the recognition of exploitation and the commitment to act together. Class consciousness illuminates the social and economic relations that bind the worker to subjugation. Solidarity provides the vehicle through which knowledge becomes action. It is not sufficient to understand the mechanisms of oppression. The workers must organize, coordinate, and insist upon their collective rights. Through strikes, assemblies, political movements, and communal resistance, solidarity gives structure to rebellion, converts awareness into negotiation, and ultimately makes revolution possible. Without solidarity, the insights of class consciousness remain theoretical, a knowledge confined to the mind of the individual. Without consciousness, solidarity risks becoming reformist, constrained by the rules and ideologies of the very system it seeks to transform. The promise of liberation is therefore inseparable from the twin pillars of awareness and unity. To awaken to the reality of exploitation is to see the necessity of collective struggle. To unite in struggle is to actualize the potential revealed by awareness. Workers are the producers of all wealth, and only through mutual recognition of power and organized effort can they assert control over society. Class consciousness and solidarity are the instruments through which dependence is overturned, through which labor becomes liberation, and through which the oppressed can claim dominion over their own lives. The very foundations of capitalist society are built upon the subjugation of the majority by a small, property-owning minority. To speak of liberation without action is to speak in abstractions, for knowledge of exploitation alone does not dismantle the structures that enforce it. Capitalism survives not merely through wealth, but through the careful orchestration of consent, dependence, and division among the laboring masses. It is maintained by laws, institutions, and customs designed to normalize exploitation, by education and culture that teach the worker to accept hierarchy as natural, and by the constant threat of deprivation for those who resist. In such a system, collective organization is not a matter of convenience, it is a necessity. No individual, however skilled or determined, can overcome the entrenched power of capital. The forces arrayed against the worker are too vast, the mechanisms of extraction too sophisticated, and the social apparatus too deeply entrenched to be challenged in isolation. Only through collective effort can the laboring class acquire the strength to confront, destabilize, and ultimately dismantle the structures that oppress it. Organization begins with recognition that the fate of one worker is inseparable from the fate of all. Each workplace, each industry, each sector of labor may appear distinct, yet they are united by a common dynamic, the extraction of surplus value by capital and the subjugation of labor. Collective organization allows workers to transcend the illusions of competition and individual struggle that capitalism imposes. It transforms scattered grievances into coordinated strategies, diffused discontent into focused demands, and isolated vulnerability into collective power. Unions, councils, assemblies, and networks of solidarity are not mere instruments of reform. They are the embryonic structures of revolutionary capacity, laboratories in which workers learn to act in concert, to plan strategically, and to assert control over production and social life. Without such organization, revolt is fragmented, ephemeral, and easily suppressed. Revolt, when grounded in collective organization, becomes the decisive instrument of transformation. Capitalism, for all its sophistication, relies upon the laboring majority's submission and inertia. It fears the uprising of the collective far more than any intellectual critique or individual protest. Revolt is the point at which awareness of oppression is transformed into action. When workers refuse to accept exploitation as inevitable and seize the means to reshape society. Historical evidence confirms this. Revolutions, strikes, and insurrections demonstrate that when workers act collectively, they can confront armies, governments, and economic elites. The structures of capital are not indestructible. They are social relations that have been institutionalized over centuries, and like all human constructions, they can be dismantled when those who sustain them withdraw their labor, their compliance, and their consent. Collective organization and revolt are inseparable. Strategy without action achieves nothing. Action without coordination achieves little. Revolt must be planned, disciplined, and conscious of the systemic nature of oppression. The working class must not only resist immediate exploitation, but also envision the society that will replace the capitalist order. This requires education, mutual aid, and the cultivation of solidarity across industries, regions, and communities. Workers must recognize that the capitalist system is not merely an economic hierarchy, but a social apparatus encompassing politics, law, culture, and ideology. To dismantle it, revolt must extend beyond isolated acts of resistance and address the entire network of domination, confronting the ownership of the means of production, the distribution of wealth, and the ideological mechanisms that legitimize inequality. Capitalism's survival depends upon the perpetuation of dependence and division. By keeping workers scattered, mistrustful, and focused on immediate individual needs, it prevents the emergence of coordinated, systemic opposition. Collective organization counters this by creating structures that facilitate communication, planning, and mutual support. It turns individual grievances into political leverage, allowing the laboring class to negotiate not from weakness but from strength. Revolt, then, is the natural consequence of sustained organization, a force that cannot be ignored, bribed, or pacified by reforms that leave the underlying relations of exploitation intact. Without revolt, organization risks stagnation. Without organization, revolt risks failure. Together, they are the means by which the capitalist edifice can be dismantled and replaced with a society that prioritizes human need over private profit. The necessity of revolt is also ethical and historical. Capitalism cannot be reformed into justice. It must be replaced. Its structures are inherently exploitative design, to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the few while subordinating the majority. Revolt is not merely a response to injustice, it is the assertion of human agency against a system that denies autonomy, the act of reclaiming control over the conditions of life, and the demonstration that the laboring class is the true source of social wealth and power. Collective organization ensures that revolt is effective, disciplined, and sustained, transforming spontaneous anger into systemic challenge, and exposing the vulnerability of capitalist institutions that appear invincible but rely entirely upon the labor of those they oppress. The society we inhabit today is structured around profit extraction and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Every institution, every law, every cultural norm serves the accumulation of capital rather than the flourishing of human life. Dependence on wages, credit, and market mechanisms has become a condition of existence, and through this dependence, the majority of humanity is subordinated to the interests of a small minority. Yet true social transformation demands more than reform. It requires a complete reorientation of society from one that places profit at its center to one that prioritizes human needs. cooperation, and collective well-being. This transformation is not a mere moral aspiration, it is a historical necessity, emerging from the contradictions inherent in a system that exploits labor while claiming to offer freedom. Capitalism can never produce a society of justice, equity, or solidarity, because its logic is precisely the accumulation of wealth by some through the subordination of others. Therefore, the emancipation of humanity requires the construction of social relations grounded not in competition and dependence, but in cooperation and mutual support. Human-centered cooperation begins with the recognition of our interdependence. The laborer produces the food, the energy, the goods, and the knowledge that sustains life, yet under capitalism. The fruits of this labor are seized and concentrated, while workers are pitted against each other in competition for survival. The natural inclination toward collaboration, toward mutual aid, is suppressed in favor of self-interest as dictated by the market. In a society organized around human needs rather than profit, this cooperation would be restored. Work would no longer be a mechanism of survival or a tool of exploitation, but an activity through which individuals contribute to the collective well-being while fulfilling their own potential. The division between labor and leisure, production and life, would be reimagined so that labor becomes an expression of creativity and communal responsibility rather than a commodity to be bought, sold, or coerced. Profit-driven dependence undermines not only economic equality but also social solidarity. Under capitalism, scarcity is manufactured, competition is glorified, and the worker is isolated, anxious, and alienated from the products of their labor. This alienation is not merely material, it is psychological, shaping thought, behavior, and social relations. Individuals are taught to value themselves in relation to their capacity to produce for capital, to see others as rivals rather than allies, and to accept hierarchy as natural. True transformation requires dismantling these structures, creating systems in which cooperation replaces competition and collective well-being replaces private accumulation as the organizing principle of society. Communities, workplaces, and institutions would be organized not around the maximization of profit, but around meeting human needs, fostering creativity, and sustaining relationships. In such a society, dependence is no longer a mechanism of control, but a mutual interdependence that strengthens rather than weakens the collective. Human-centered cooperation also requires the democratization of production. In a capitalist society, the means of production, the factories, farms, resources, and knowledge are controlled by those who do not themselves perform the labor. Decisions about what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce are made in the interest of profit rather than necessity. Social transformation demands that these decisions be returned to the people whose labor sustains society. Workers must have control over the processes, resources, and outcomes of production, so that production itself serves human needs rather than capital accumulation. When labor is collectively directed, dependence on the whims of capital is replaced by participation in the shaping of society. The economic system becomes a tool for human development, not a mechanism for exploitation. Education, health, housing, and social services must similarly be oriented toward human needs rather than market profit. Under capitalism, these essential components of life are treated as commodities, available only to those who can pay. Human-centered cooperation transforms them into universally accessible resources, ensuring that no individual is subjugated by deprivation or coerced into submission by dependence. Social relations, then, are not mediated by wealth, status, or competition, but by mutual responsibility and solidarity. Dependence is replaced by a network of reciprocal support, in which each individual contributes according to capacity and receives according to need, and in which human flourishing becomes the measure of societal success. Ultimately, the transformation from profit-driven dependence to human-centered cooperation is not a simple adjustment of policy, but a revolution in the structure of society itself. It requires the collective assertion of the working class, and oppressed against the institutions that sustain exploitation, the creation of new economic, political, and social structures grounded in solidarity, and the persistent commitment to aligning human activity with human need. Only through such a fundamental reorientation can dependence cease to be a tool of control, competition cease to dominate social life, and cooperation become the foundation of a society in which people, rather than capital, determine the conditions of their existence. Comrades, the truths we have examined are not abstract theories, they are the reality of our daily lives, the invisible chains that bind us, the mechanisms through which dependence becomes domination, and freedom is revealed as illusion. Capital thrives on division, on ignorance, on the isolation of the worker, yet within this very dependence lies the seed of liberation. Awareness of exploitation, recognition of shared struggle, and the unity of the labouring class are the forces that can overturn the power of the few. Class consciousness awakens the mind, solidarity mobilizes the body. Organization and revolt give shape and direction to our collective strength. And in the vision of a society governed not by profit but by human need, dependence is transformed into cooperation, scarcity into abundance, alienation into fulfillment, and oppression into emancipation. Let the workers see that their labour, their intellect, and their courage are the true sources of wealth and power. Let the oppressed understand that their collective action is unstoppable, their solidarity unbreakable, their consciousness the spark of history itself. The capitalist structures that dominate our lives are not eternal, they are human creations. And like all human creations, they can be dismantled, reshaped, and replaced. The path forward is clear: organize, unite, resist, and build a society in which human beings determine the conditions of life rather than serving the dictates of capital. Comrades, the struggle is ours, the power is ours, and the promise of liberation is ours to claim. History moves through the hands of those who labour, and the day will come when dependence is no longer a tool of control but a testament to the strength of collective action. Let us rise together, not as isolated individuals, but as a united class, determined to reclaim what has been stolen, to assert our rights, and to create a world in which freedom, equality, and human dignity are not illusions, but the very foundation of society.